It establishes the main character, Kong Severin, as a feared Korean Mafia boss who holds absolute power over the city, yet is completely powerless to find Yoon Hae-rin, a woman vital to his survival, after weeks of a frantic, clandestine search. It creates immediate intrigue by revealing that the missing woman is currently in the care of a defiant, poor female janitor, Tasha Miller, who is fiercely protecting her against the world, unaware of the immense danger she has just invited upon herself by taking the elderly woman in. The neon lights of Seoul blurred through the rain-slicked window of the blacked-out sedan, but Kong Severin didn't see them. His gaze was fixed on the city passing by, his expression a mask of cold, agonizing fury. 18 days. For 18 days, the highest-ranking men in his organization had scoured every district, shaken down every informant, and turned over every stone looking for Yoon Hae-rin. Severin gripped the handle of his briefcase until his knuckles turned white. She was more than just a woman to him. She was the cornerstone of his past, the keeper of secrets that could destroy his empire, and the only person who had ever looked at him not as a monster, but as a man. Without her, the ruthless calm he maintained felt brittle, ready to shatter at any moment. He had already threatened to dismantle his own lieutenants if they didn't bring her back, but the city had swallowed her whole. 3 miles away, in a cramped apartment that smelled faintly of lavender and cleaning products, Tasha Miller wiped the sweat from her forehead. The industrial jumpsuit she wore felt heavy, a stark contrast to the quiet intimacy of her current task. She adjusted the blanket around the frail elderly woman sleeping soundly in the only bed the apartment possessed. Tasha, who worked double shifts at the restaurant to barely keep the lights on, had found the woman wandering in the rain 2 weeks ago. Confused, shaking and muttering in a language Tasha didn't understand, the woman was defenseless against the harsh city. Tasha, despite her own struggles, couldn't just walk away. She had brought her home, given her warm broth, and tucked her into bed while she herself took the small mattress on the floor. Tasha had tried to look for clues, scanning the news for missing persons, but with her broken memory, the woman, whom Tasha had started calling Hae-rin, based on a faint sound she made, had no identifiable past. Tasha didn't know who this woman was, only that she was kind, fragile, and needed protection. As Tasha watched her sleep, she vowed that as long as she had breath, no one would hurt this vulnerable soul. She had no idea that the silent, menacing search currently tearing the city apart was looking for the very person she was fiercely guarding, or that her own defiant nature was about to collide with the most dangerous man in Korea. The heavy glass door of the gilded palette swung open, and the atmosphere inside instantly curdled. Patrons who had been enjoying their evening stopped speaking, the ambient noise of clinking silverware dying instantly. Kong Severin walked in not like a guest, but like a landlord collecting on a debt that hadn't been paid. He wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp white shirt, his expression a terrifying mix of exhaustion and focused rage. Marcus Boyd, the restaurant owner, hurried from behind the bar, his face pale, frantically trying to intercept the mafia boss before he reached the main dining area. Severin didn't even acknowledge him, his icy gaze surveying the room as if looking for a ghost. He was here because a confidential tip had placed a woman matching Hae-rin's description in this neighborhood weeks ago. From the cleaning station near the back kitchen, Tasha Miller saw him. She didn't freeze like the others. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear, but from a desperate protective instinct. She knew immediately who he was, the man from the missing posters that were now plastered all over the city. She shoved her broom into the corner, grabbing the worn, crumpled poster she had kept in her pocket, the edges frayed from being folded and unfolded a dozen times. She walked straight towards him, her heavy industrial boots making a stark rhythm on the polished floor. "You're looking for her," Tasha said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. Severin stopped, turning slowly to look at the woman in the gray maintenance uniform. His eyebrows furrowed in annoyance and scrutiny. He looked down at the poster she held out with both hands, the black and white photo of an elderly East Asian woman staring back at him. It was the face he had searched for nearly 3 weeks. He snatched the paper from her, his intense eyes scanning the weathered creases as if searching for a hidden message in the torn edges. "Where is she?" Severin demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that made Marcus Boyd cringe in the background. Tasha stood her ground, her eyes wide but defiant, pointing at the poster in his hands. "She has no family, sir. She lives with me. The room seemed to hold its breath. No one ever spoke to Kong Severin like that, let alone a staff member in industrial gear. Severin paused, the sheer audacity of her statement disrupting his cold, calculated fury. He had expected a tip from an informant, not a confrontation from a woman who looked like she was struggling to make rent. His intense focus shifted from the poster to Tasha, a flicker of genuine shock momentarily shattering his stoic mask. He realized with a jolt that the answer to his agonizing search wasn't in a back alley or a police station, but right here in the defiant gaze of this janitor. Severin's silence was heavier than the threat of violence. He stared at Tasha, not seeing a janitor anymore, but a puzzle piece that didn't fit into his ruthless worldview. He looked from her defiant eyes down to the weathered poster in his hand, then back to her. A faint, nearly imperceptible nod was all he gave, a command disguised as a gesture. "Show me," he said, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of a decree. Tasha didn't hesitate. She threw her apron onto a nearby chair, signaling to a stunned Marcus Boyd that she was leaving, and walked past the imposing mafia boss. She knew she was taking a massive risk. If this was a trap, or if she was mistaken, her life wouldn't be worth a dime, but the conviction in her heart held her fear at bay. They walked out into the cold, rainy night, Severin's blacked-out sedan idling nearby with his silent, menacing security detail watching from the tinted windows. Tasha walked down the alleyway, her heavy boots clicking on the wet pavement, leading him away from the polished streets toward the dilapidated residential area behind the restaurant district. The neighborhood grew progressively shabbier, the neon lights giving way to broken street lamps and shadows. Tasha could feel Severin's intense gaze on her back, his presence bringing a terrifying tension to the quiet streets. She finally stopped in front of a rust-colored apartment building that looked like it might collapse from a strong gust of wind. "Second floor," she said, bracing herself as she led him up the creaking staircase. The air in the hallway was thick with the smell of damp wood and cooking oil. She stopped at door 2B, her hand trembling slightly as she turned the key in the lock. The door opened to reveal a space barely large enough to be called an apartment, a tiny kitchen area, a small table and a twin bed tucked against the far wall. On the bed, barely visible under a patchwork quilt, was the elderly woman sleeping peacefully. Severin stepped inside, his large frame making the small apartment feel instantly claustrophobic. He didn't look at the dirt or the squalor. His eyes were fixed on the sleeping figure. As he approached the bed, the woman stirred, opening her eyes to look at him with a confused, gentle gaze. "Yama," she whispered. Severin froze, the hardened facade finally cracking as he realized the woman he had searched for was truly here, safe, in the care of the last person he would have ever expected. Severin stood frozen by the bedside, the roar of the city outside fading into a distant murmur. The woman in the bed, Hyrin, was fragile, her hair silvered by time and distress, but she was alive. Safe. She reached out a trembling hand, her eyes losing their haze for a moment to focus on the man towering over her. "You came," she whispered, a gentle smile breaking through her confusion. Severin felt a lump rise in his throat, a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a terrified child. He slowly sank to his knees beside the bed, taking her hand in his armored exterior completely collapsing in the quiet intimacy of the tiny room. Tasha stood by the doorway, her industrial uniform feeling suddenly out of place. She watched the ruthless tycoon, the man who held the city in a vice grip, weeping silently over an elderly woman who didn't fully understand where she was. Tasha had expected fear, perhaps anger that she had kept the woman here, but she hadn't expected this raw, human vulnerability. She hadn't done this for money. She hadn't even known who Hyrin was. She had just seen a person in need. Severin finally looked up, his gaze shifting from Hyrin to Tasha. In his world, loyalty was bought with fear or money, and favors were always a transaction. But as he looked around the meager apartment, the single bed, the sparse food in the small pantry, the utter lack of luxury, he realized Tasha had taken on a massive risk simply because it was the right thing to do. She had protected his most precious person without knowing she was holding the key to his empire. The cold, calculating calculation that usually drove him was replaced by a strange new sensation, gratitude. He stood up, towering over her, but for the first time the menace was gone. "You didn't ask for anything," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Why?" Tasha shrugged, her defiance returning in the face of his intense scrutiny. "She was hungry, sir. She was scared. It didn't matter who she was." Severin looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a servant, but as a person of uncompromising integrity. The debt he owed her was immense, and he realized with a start that his view of her had shifted completely. She was no longer just a staff member from the restaurant. She was now an ally in the dangerous game he played. The relief of finding Hai-Rin was short-lived, replaced instantly by a chilling realization that solidified in Severin's mind the moment he saw the bruise on Hai-Rin's wrist. It was a faint, purple mark, but it spoke volumes to him. He gently pulled up her sleeve, his face darkening with a familiar, cold fury that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with betrayal. This wasn't the work of a rival gang trying to squeeze him for territory. The method was too precise, too personal. He stood up, towering over the small apartment again, the gratitude he felt for Tasha momentarily overshadowed by the need for vengeance. "They didn't just take her," Severin murmured, more to himself than to Tasha. "They knew exactly where she would be vulnerable." He walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked alley, his mind racing through the last 18 days. The false leads, the intercepted messages, the way his own men seemed to be one step behind. It all pointed in one direction. A direction he had refused to consider because it was too close to home. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number that wasn't listed in his contacts, his voice low and dangerous as he spoke in rapid Korean. Tasha couldn't understand the words, but the tone made her blood run cold. "Era," he said, his voice dripping with venom. He turned back to the room, his eyes scanning the space, realizing that even this cramped apartment wasn't safe anymore. His sister Kong Era was behind this. She was the one who had arranged the kidnapping, hoping to destabilize his rule by removing Hai-Rin from the equation, and she was surely already searching for them. Era wanted the empire and she was willing to destroy everything, and everyone in her way to get it. Severin looked at Tasha, then at the sleeping Hai-Rin, realizing the immense danger he had brought directly to this young woman's door. The debt he owed Tasha just got much higher, and the fight for their survival had just become personal. He had to act fast, or they would all be dead before morning. Severin didn't just walk out of the apartment, he cleared it. With a few swift, efficient commands in Korean, his security detail men who had been waiting in the shadows of the alley surrounded the dilapidated building. The air became thick with tension, a stark contrast to the quiet domestic life Tasha had carved out here. Severin turned to her, his expression a terrifying mix of urgency and resolve. "This place is compromised. Era knows." Tasha didn't need to ask who Era was. The fear in Severin's eyes told her everything. She looked at Hai-Rin, who was watching the commotion with wide, frightened eyes, and knew she had no choice. She quickly packed a small bag with essentials, her hands trembling not just with fear, but with the realization that her quiet life was officially over. The car ride to Severin's estate was silent, the only sound the hum of the powerful engine and the rain beating against the armored windows. Severin sat rigidly, his phone constantly buzzing with reports he didn't bother to answer, his focus split between the road and the two women beside him. Tasha watched the city fly by, feeling the weight of the massive, cold world she was being thrust into. She was a janitor who lived paycheck to paycheck. She didn't belong in the world of mafia bosses and heavily guarded estates. Yet, when she looked at Hai-Rin, she knew she couldn't leave her. The estate was a fortress, high walls topped with security cameras and armed guards patrolling the grounds. The irony wasn't lost on Tasha. She had spent weeks protecting Hai-Rin in a tiny apartment, and now she was bringing her into the heart of the very danger she was trying to avoid. As they stepped out of the car, Severin's subordinates bowed low, their faces impassive but their eyes scanning the area with professional intensity. Tasha felt exposed in her worn maintenance uniform, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Severin directed his men to take Hai-Rin to the main house, but he stopped Tasha with a hand on her arm. "You stay close to me," he commanded, his voice firm but devoid of the harshness he had displayed in the restaurant. Bringing Tasha here was a massive complication to his rigid, structured world. She was an outsider, a civilian, and her presence was a glaring vulnerability. Yet, as he looked at her, He knew he couldn't put her anywhere else. He owed her his life, and in this fortress he would ensure she and Hai-Rin would never be in danger again, even if it meant turning his own world upside down. The move wasn't safe enough. Severin felt it in the cold air of the estate, a phantom sensation of danger that had kept him alive this long. He ordered the convoy to leave for a more secure, secondary location under the cover of a torrential downpour. 3 armored SUVs moved in a tight formation, Tasha and Hai-Rin secured in the center vehicle with Severin, while his most loyal men flanked them. The tension inside the car was stifling. Hai-Rin was asleep, exhausted from the move, while Tasha stared out the window, watching the city lights blur, feeling out of her element in the armored vehicle. Severin was looking at his phone, issuing orders in a low, sharp tone, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror constantly. The attack came at a red light in a narrow intersection. An unmarked van slammed into the front SUV, overturning it instantly. The sound of screeching metal was immediately followed by the sharp, terrifying pop of gunfire. Severin didn't yell. He reacted. "Get down!" he roared, grabbing Tasha and pulling her and Hai-Rin to the floorboards as bullets shattered the windows, rain pouring into the armored car. His security team moved with trained precision, returning fire, but they were outnumbered. Tasha, terror paralyzing her for only a split second, saw Hai-Rin shaking, her eyes wide with confused fear. The elderly woman began to panic, trying to stand up into the line of fire. Without thinking, Tasha threw herself over Hai-Rin, shielding her with her own body, ignoring the glass raining down on them. She grabbed a heavy briefcase from the seat and shoved it against the door for extra cover, her defiance blazing through the sheer panic. "Stay down!" Tasha screamed, not at the attackers but at Hai-Rin, her voice sharp with desperate protective authority. Severin, busy coordinating a counterattack while shielding them with his own body, looked at Tasha with a mixture of shock and profound respect. She was supposed to be the vulnerable one, the civilian he was protecting, but she was fighting back with a raw, primal bravery. The ambush was chaotic, intense, and deadly, but Tasha's actions provided the vital seconds Severin needed to eliminate the threat. As the gunfire finally ceased, leaving the intersection riddled with holes, Severin knew he hadn't just saved a janitor, he had found a warrior. The ambush wasn't over. As the smoke cleared, more of Era's men emerged from the shadows of the alley, their weapons aimed directly at the now defenseless SUV. Severin didn't hesitate. His usual calculated approach, the one that dictated he should stay covered and eliminate threats from safety, evaporated instantly. He looked at Tasha, who was still shielding Hai-Rin, her gaze defiant despite the terror in her eyes. The rulebook of his ruthless existence, the one he had lived by for 15 years, commanded him to prioritize the mission, to prioritize himself. But that rulebook had been written by a man who had never felt gratitude, never felt the raw, protective instinct Tasha had just displayed. "Get behind the engine block," Severin commanded, his voice sharp with authority, pushing Tasha and Hai-Rin toward the only cover remaining. He didn't wait to see if they obeyed. Severin stepped out into the open, his own weapon roaring, drawing the fire of the attackers away from the 2 women. Bullets whizzed past him, grazing his shoulder, but he didn't feel the pain. His mind was entirely focused on creating a path for Tasha. He was violating his own ironclad code. Never let emotion dictate action. He was sacrificing his tactical advantage for a civilian, a janitor, who had dared to challenge his rigid world. The sound of sirens finally echoed in the distance, but Severin knew it was too late. He needed to finish this now. He charged forward, eliminating the remaining threats with a cold efficiency that contradicted the desperate desperation of his actions. When the last attacker fell, Severin rushed back to Tasha, checking her for injuries with hands that were finally shaking. "Are you hit?" he asked, his voice breathless, breaking through his icy composure. Tasha looked at him, shaking her head, the defiance finally giving way to profound shock. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of the ambush, Severin realized he had not just broken his own rules, he had completely rewritten them. He had risked everything for someone who had nothing to offer him but her humanity, and for the first time in his life, he didn't regret it. The calculated monster was gone. In his place was a man who understood that protecting the weak was not a weakness, but the truest form of strength. The secondary safe house was not a home, but a fortress, filled with the harsh scent of antiseptic and the silent, menacing presence of Severin's loyal men. He didn't stay long. After ensuring Tasha and Hai-Rin were guarded by his most trusted lieutenant, Severin left, his shoulder aching, his blood cold. The betrayal ran deep, and the only way to heal it was to tear it out by the root. He drove fast through the rain-slicked city, his armored sedan cutting through the night like a shark through dark water. He was done with diplomacy, done with the pretense of familial love. Era had attacked a civilian. She had endangered Hai-Rin. She had violated the one absolute law of his existence. He arrived at the sprawling, cold compound that served as Era's headquarters, his men securing the perimeter before anyone knew he was there. Severin walked straight into the main office, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Era was seated at a massive mahogany desk, sipping tea, her expression impassive as she looked up. She didn't look surprised to see him. "You're late, brother," she said, her voice smooth, devoid of any guilt. Severin didn't answer with words. He slammed his hand onto the desk, leaning down until they were eye to eye. The raw fury radiating from him was a tangible force in the room. He didn't speak of the attack, didn't speak of the lives lost. He spoke of the betrayal. He laid out the evidence, the intercepted messages, the timing of the kidnappings, his voice low, shaking with suppressed rage. Era smiled, a cold, sharp expression. "You were weak, Severin. You let that old woman soften you. I did what was necessary to secure the family. You did what was necessary for your own ambition," Severin countered, his voice dripping with venom. "And now you have nothing." He didn't kill her. He couldn't, not in this office, not yet. Instead, he shattered her world. With a single phone call, he ordered his men to liquidate her assets, freeze her accounts, and exile her loyal followers. He told her she had until sunrise to leave the city, or he would hunt her down himself. Era, seeing the absolute coldness in his eyes, a coldness she had taught him, but which he had now elevated to a new level, knew she had lost. She stood, her composure finally breaking, and fled, her ambition reduced to ashes. Severin stood alone in the office, his territory secure, but the victory felt hollow. He had won the war, but he realized that the person who mattered most wasn't standing beside him to share it. Severin returned to the safe house not as a conqueror, but as a man exhausted by the relentless demands of his own brutality. The compound was quiet, the menace of his men subdued by the early hours of the morning. He found Tasha in the kitchen area, staring out at the manicured gardens, her maintenance uniform stark against the opulence of the room. She didn't turn when he entered, but her shoulders tense, acknowledging his presence. Severin stopped a few feet behind her, the adrenaline of the reckoning fading, leaving behind a cold emptiness he couldn't quite identify. "Era is gone," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the triumph he should have felt. Tasha finally turned, her eyes searching his face, looking past the ruthless boss to the man underneath. "Did you kill her?" "No," Severin replied, walking to the counter and pouring himself a drink. "But she will never trouble us again." Tasha watched him, her defiant spirit still burning bright, completely unimpressed by his display of power. She had seen him on his knees, she had seen him fight for them, and she knew there was more to him than just the terror he instilled in the city. "That's not what I meant, Severin," she said softly, walking toward him. "You secured your territory. You won. But did you win anything worth having?" Severin paused, the glass halfway to his lips. "I kept you safe. I kept Hai-Rin safe." "You did," Tasha agreed, her voice firm. "But you did it by becoming the very thing you were fighting. You ruled through fear, Severin. That's how Era could even think about taking your place. She thought you were weak because you were scared of losing power." Severin stared at her, the audacity of her words striking him with more force than any bullet. No one dared to criticize his methods, especially not a civilian. But he didn't feel anger. He felt a strange sense of clarity. "What would you have me do?" he asked, a genuine question breaking through his usual stoicism. Tasha stepped closer, her expression intense, sincere. "Stop ruling through fear, Severin. Start protecting with love. You saved me because you cared, not because it was strategic. Use that. The city doesn't need another monster. It needs a guardian." He looked at her, truly seeing the strength she carried, A strength that had nothing to do with weapons or territory. Tasha was challenging him to change, to abandon the only way of life he had ever known. It was a terrifying prospect, but as he stood in the quiet kitchen, looking into her defiant eyes, Severin felt the cold armor around his heart cracking, perhaps for the last time. The silence that followed Tasha's challenge was not heavy, but charged. A quiet space where the frantic pacing of Severin's life seemed to finally slow down. He stood there, the glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand, looking at the woman who had brought nothing into his life but chaos, and yet had somehow saved him. Her defiance, the very thing that had startled him in the restaurant, was now the only thing anchoring him to the ground. He had spent his life surrounded by people who feared him, who manipulated him, or who worshipped him. Tasha did none of those things. She saw him, really saw him, not just as the boss of the city, but as a man who had forgotten how to live. He set the glass down and took a step towards her. The intense, distressed expression that usually defined his face had softened, replaced by a raw vulnerability he hadn't shown in decades. "No one has ever spoken to me like that," he murmured, his voice low, lacking its usual sharp edge. Tasha didn't back away. She stood her ground, her wide eyes focused on him, that same stubborn defiance mingling with something gentler. "Then maybe it's time you listened." Severin reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The action was incredibly simple, yet it felt monumental in the context of their world. The ice that had armored his heart for so long wasn't just cracking. It was melting under the warmth of her gaze. He realized with a jolt that his frantic, cold obsession with power was nothing compared to the quiet strength he found in her presence. The romantic connection wasn't explosive. It was a slow, steady realization that she was the only person who made him want to be better. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, and in that quiet, intimate moment in the heart of his fortress, Kong Severin finally let go of the fear that had dictated his life, choosing instead the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of love. The morning light that filtered through the high windows of the estate was a stark contrast to the darkness that had defined Severin's world for so long. The compound was quiet, the frantic energy of the ambush replaced by a calm, structured routine. Severin stood in his study, looking over documents that were no longer meant to expand his criminal empire, but to secure it. He had spent the early hours liquidating Era's remaining assets and shifting his own operations away from risky, violent ventures towards legitimate businesses that would guarantee the long-term safety of those he cared about. The ruthless Chairman Jay was gone. In his place was a man taking responsibility for a new, quieter future. He walked out onto the terrace, finding Tasha and Hai-Rin enjoying the morning air. Hai-Rin was laughing at something Tasha said, the confusion in her eyes replaced by a gentle serenity. Seeing them together, safe and happy, brought a warmth to Severin's chest that he was no longer afraid of. He had already set up a trust fund for Tasha, ensuring she would never have to work in a diner again, and had secured a top-tier medical team to help Hai-Rin regain her memories in a comfortable, loving environment. He had used his power not to intimidate, but to construct a sanctuary. Tasha looked up, her defiant gaze softening as she saw him approaching. She saw the change in his posture, the lack of tension in his shoulders. Severin didn't say anything at first. He simply stood beside her, looking out over the gardens. He had learned that true strength wasn't about dominating others through fear. It was about protecting the vulnerable with unwavering love. The debt he owed Tasha was one he intended to repay for the rest of his life, not with money, but with his presence and his devotion. He had finally secured his territory, not by conquering enemies, but by fostering a home. For the first time in his adult life, Kong Severin was truly safe, not because of the walls around him, but because of the humanity he had finally allowed himself to embrace.